Imagine you are a police officer in rural Bavaria, Germany. The year is 1922. You receive a report that a family on a remote farm hasn't been seen in days. The neighbors are worried. So you make the journey down the long, muddy road that leads out into the countryside, surrounded by bare fields and leafless trees, and you arrive at a small, quiet farmstead. You knock on the door. No answer. You push it open and step inside. The kitchen table still has food on it. A half-eaten meal. A cup that was never finished. You call out. Silence. You search the house. Nothing. But something feels wrong. The air is heavy. There is a stillness that doesn't belong to an empty house. It belongs to something else entirely. Then you go to the barn. And what you find there will follow you for the rest of your life. Welcome. My name is, your name, and today we are going deep into one of the most disturbing, most haunting, and most completely unsolved murder cases in the history of the world. Not the history of Germany. Not the history of Europe. The history of the world. Because what happened at Hinterkaifeck farm on the night of March 31st, 1922 is not just a murder story. It is a story about fear. About isolation. About the darkness that can exist right next to ordinary life, completely invisible, waiting. And it is a story with no ending. Because the killer was never caught. Not a single suspect was ever arrested. Not a single person was ever charged. Not a single trial was ever held. 6 people died. And whoever killed them walked away clean. For over 100 years, investigators, historians, forensic scientists, and criminologists have studied this case. They have proposed suspects, built timelines, analyzed the physical evidence, and interviewed descendants of the people involved. And still, nothing. The Hinterkaifeck murders remain one of the great unsolved crimes of the 20th century. So today, we are going to go through everything. From the beginning. We are going to talk about who these people were, what strange events preceded the murders, what happened on that terrible night, what investigators found when they finally arrived, and why, despite more than 100 years of effort, no one has ever been able to say with certainty, this is who did it. By the time this video ends, you will know this case better than most people on Earth. But you will not know who the killer was. And that, I promise you, is the most terrifying part of all. Let's begin. To understand Hinterkaifeck, you first need to understand the world it existed in. The year is 1922. Germany is in chaos. Just 4 years earlier, the First World War had ended, the deadliest conflict the world had ever seen up to that point. Millions of German soldiers had died. Millions more came home broken, traumatized, physically destroyed. The country had lost the war and was now drowning in the consequences. The Treaty of Versailles had imposed enormous reparations on Germany. The economy was collapsing. Hyperinflation would reach catastrophic levels within the next year. By late 1923, a single loaf of bread would cost billions of marks. People were carrying money in wheelbarrows and it still wasn't enough. Political violence was everywhere. Far-right groups were forming. Communist uprisings were being crushed in the streets. The entire fabric of German society felt like it was tearing apart at the seams. And in the countryside, in rural Bavaria especially, people were trying to hold on to the old ways. Farming families like the Grubers had always been isolated. They didn't follow the news from the cities. They didn't trust outsiders. They kept their business to themselves and they expected others to do the same. This isolation was both a way of life and, as we will see, a fatal vulnerability. Because in the countryside in 1922, if something went wrong on your farm, nobody would know for days. There were no telephones in the Hinterkaifeck farmhouse. No radio. No way to call for help. And the roads, dirt tracks, really, became almost impassable in the cold and wet of late March. The Hinterkaifeck farm itself was located in the municipality of Weidhofen, in the district of Schrobenhausen. If you look it up on a modern map, you can find approximately where it stood. But today, there is nothing there. The farmhouse is gone. The barn is gone. The land has been reclaimed by nature. But in 1922, it was very much real. And very much alive. The farm was modest but functional. There were animals, cows, chickens, pigs. There were fields that needed tending. There was a main farmhouse with several rooms, a barn attached or adjacent to it, and the kind of practical, unglamorous infrastructure that rural working families depended on to survive. It was not a wealthy place. But it was a working place. And the people who lived there had built their lives around it. Now let me tell you about those people. 6 people lived at Hinterkaifeck in March of 1922. Let me introduce them to you one by one. Because before they became victims, they were people. They had histories, relationships, secrets, and contradictions. And understanding who they were is essential to understanding what happened to them. The first is Andreas Gruber. Andreas was 63 years old. He was the patriarch, the head of the household, the owner of the farm, the man whose name was on the deed. By all accounts, he was a difficult person to know. Neighbors described him as gruff, stubborn, and private. He did not socialize easily. He was not the kind of man who came into the village to share a beer and talk about the week. He kept to himself, and he kept his family close and shielded from outsiders. But there was more to Andreas than simple reclusiveness. There were rumors in the village. Deeply uncomfortable rumors. Rumors that concerned his relationship with his own daughter, Victoria. I want to be careful here, because these rumors were never conclusively proven. But they were taken seriously enough by investigators that they became a documented part of the case. The suggestion was that Andreas had fathered Victoria's youngest child, Joseph. That the relationship between father and daughter was something it should never have been. This is important not because it changes our sympathy for the victims, it doesn't, they were still victims, but because it tells us something about the internal dynamics of this family. About the secrets being kept. About who might have had a motive. We will return to this. The second person is Cecilia Gruber, Andreas's wife. She was 72 years old. The eldest member of the household. By all accounts, she was quieter than her husband, more inward, less confrontational. She had spent decades on that farm. It was her whole world. She knew every corner of it, every creak of the floorboards, every sound the barn made at night. If something had been wrong in the days before the murders, Cecilia would have known. The third person is Victoria Gabriel. Victoria was 35 years old. She was Andreas and Cecilia's daughter. She had been married to a man named Karl Gabriel, who had gone to fight in the First World War and had been declared killed in action. But Karl Gabriel's body was never found. This detail will become very important later. Victoria was left a widow with 2 children and returned to the family farm. Life as a single mother in rural Bavaria in the 1920s was hard. She was dependent on her parents. She had no real independence. And she was living in a household that, as we've discussed, may have held terrible secrets. The 4th and 5th members of the household are Victoria's 2 children. 7-year-old Cecilia, named after her grandmother, was a schoolgirl. She was described as a bright and talkative child. She had friends in the village. She went to school. She was, by all accounts, perfectly ordinary in the best possible way, curious, energetic, full of the particular noise that only small children can make. And then there was Joseph. 2 years old. Too young for school. Too young for memories. Too young for any of this. Joseph's father was listed as unknown on official documents. But as I mentioned, rumors swirled around the village. The two names most often associated with his paternity were Andreas Gruber, his own grandfather, and a local farmer named Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who had at different times both claimed and denied being the father. The truth of Joseph's origins may have died with everyone in that house. And finally, the sixth person, Maria Baumgartner. Maria was the new maid. She was not part of the Gruber family. She was an employee, a working woman who had taken a job at the farm to earn a living. She arrived on March 31, 1922, carrying her belongings and her whole future in front of her. She was killed on her first day. Before she had even had time to learn the layout of the house she was supposed to clean. There is something uniquely heartbreaking about Maria's story within this story. She had nothing to do with the secrets and the darkness that had been building in that family. She was simply in the wrong place. On the wrong day. And she paid for it with her life. These 6 people, Andreas, Kazilia, Victoria, young Kazilia, Joseph, and Maria, are the victims of Hinterkaifeck. Keep their names in mind. Because everything that follows is their story. Now we come to the part of the story that makes Hinterkaifeck unlike almost any other crime case I have ever studied. Because the murders didn't come out of nowhere. In the days and weeks before March 31, 1922, a series of events occurred at the Hinterkaifeck farm that were so strange, so inexplicable, so deeply unsettling, that even Andreas Gruber, a man who prided himself on self-reliance and who almost never confided in anyone, began telling people about them. He mentioned them to neighbors. He mentioned them to a local craftsman who came to do some work on the farm. He was, by all accounts, genuinely disturbed by what he had been experiencing. Let me take you through each incident, one by one. The first incident, the footprints in the snow. One morning in late winter, Andreas stepped outside and looked down at the ground. There had been fresh snowfall the night before. And in that snow, he saw footprints. They came from the direction of the tree line, from the forest that bordered the farm property. They led toward the house. And then they stopped. There were no footprints leading away. No tracks going back into the forest. No indication that whoever had made those prints had turned around and left. The only logical conclusion was one of two things: either the person was still inside the house or property somewhere. Or the tracks had been deliberately obscured or erased on the return journey, which would suggest someone who knew they were doing. Andreas searched the farm. He found nothing. But the tracks stayed in his mind. The second incident, the sounds in the attic. This began happening on multiple nights. Sounds from above. Footsteps. Movement. The kind of sounds that are unmistakably caused by a living, physical presence, not the settling of old wood or the wind pressing against the roof. Someone, or something, was moving around in the attic. Andreas went up to check. Multiple times. Each time, he found nothing. No signs of anyone. No disturbance. Nothing out of place. But the sounds continued. Night after night. The family would lie in their beds and listen to the footsteps walking slowly back and forth above their heads. Try to imagine that. You are in a remote farmhouse. The nearest neighbor is miles away. It is the middle of the night. And something is walking around above your bedroom ceiling. You go to check. Nothing. You go back to bed. And it starts again. That is what the Gruber family was living with. The third incident, the newspaper. This one is particularly chilling in its specificity. One morning, a newspaper appeared in the kitchen. Lying on the table, as if someone had simply placed it there. The family had not bought this newspaper. They had not subscribed to it. It was not a publication they read. Nobody in the household had brought it in from outside. It was simply there. A newspaper that did not belong in that house, appearing as if placed by invisible hands. The fourth incident, the missing keys. The household keys disappeared. This is perhaps the most practically alarming of all the strange events, because it suggested something very concrete, that someone had been inside the house, had found the keys, and had taken them. Or moved them. Or made a copy. When the keys reappeared, in a different location, it wasn't reassuring. It was more frightening. Because it meant that whoever had taken them had come back. The fifth and perhaps most significant incident, the previous maid quit. Before Maria Baumgartner took the job at Hinterkaifeck, there was another maid working there. Her name has been recorded but is less known than the others in this story. This woman quit her position at the Gruber farm approximately 6 months before the murders. Her reason was not illness. It was not a better job offer. It was not a family obligation. When asked, she said the farm felt wrong. That something about being there, something about the atmosphere, something she couldn't fully articulate, made her feel deeply uncomfortable. That she was convinced, in the way that the body sometimes knows things before the mind can name them, that something dark was present in that place. She called it haunted. She said she believed the house was haunted. Now, in 1922 rural Bavaria, this kind of talk was not as uncommon as it might seem to us today. Belief in the supernatural was widespread, especially among rural farming communities. So her claim wasn't treated as particularly shocking by the people who heard it. But in hindsight, it reads differently. Because a woman who spent every day in that house, who knew its rhythms and sounds, who noticed when something changed, that woman chose to leave. Urgently. Without finding another position first. She felt something. And she was right to feel it. So when Maria Baumgartner was hired to replace her, and when she packed her bags and set off down the road toward Hinterkaifeck on the morning of March 31, 1922, she was walking into a situation that had already been brewing for months. She didn't know that, of course. But whoever was watching the farm from the shadows knew she was coming. And they were ready. March 31, 1922. The exact time is unknown. We believe it was evening, after dark. But we cannot say precisely when. What we do know is this: at some point on that Saturday night, someone entered the Hinterkaifeck farm property. And before the night was over, 6 people were dead. Let me walk you through what investigators believe happened, based on the physical evidence and the position in which the bodies were eventually found. The killer, and we believe it was a single killer, acting alone, needed to separate the family. Because 6 people, even if they are not expecting danger, can be difficult to overwhelm if they are all together in the same room. So the first task was to draw them out. One at a time. The barn. The barn was where most of the victims were found. And this tells us something crucial: the barn is where the killer chose to act. Whether by luring the family there with some pretense, an animal that needed help, a sound they needed to investigate, or by some other means, the killer managed to get the family members into the barn, one after another. Andreas was probably the first. As the man of the house, he would have been the most likely to respond to something requiring attention outside. He was 63 years old and, despite his age, still the physical leader of the household. He went to the barn. He was killed there. With a blunt, heavy object, most likely a mattock, which is a farming tool resembling a combination of a pickaxe and an adze. It is the kind of tool that would have been readily available on any Bavarian farm. Then Cecilia Gruber, his wife. She would have noticed that her husband didn't return. She may have called for him. She may have gone to look. She was drawn to the barn, or she went there willingly, and she was killed in the same way. Then Victoria. Then young Cecilia. One by one. The same method. The same weapon. The bodies were found stacked together in the barn, partly covered with hay and straw. This act of concealment is significant. It suggests the killer was not panicking. He was thinking. He was working methodically. He wanted to delay discovery. He was buying himself time. And he needed that time. Because he wasn't finished. After the barn, the killer moved into the house. Maria Baumgartner was found in her room near the entrance of the farmhouse. She had been killed in the same manner as the others. She had arrived that day. She had barely had time to put down her bags. And she was gone. And finally, Joseph. 2 years old. Asleep in his cradle. He was killed there. In the cradle. Without ever waking up, we hope. Without ever knowing what was happening around him. 6 victims. All killed with the same instrument. No signs of struggle that would suggest a prolonged fight. No signs that anyone had tried to run and escape. The killer was methodical, controlled, and fast. This was not the work of someone who panicked. This was not a robbery gone wrong or an argument that escalated. This was planned. Someone came to that farm that night knowing exactly what they intended to do. And when it was over, they did not run. That is the part of this story that we need to spend the most time on. Because it is the part that changes everything. I need you to stop for a moment and really think about what I'm about to tell you. After committing 6 murders, including the murder of 2 children, one of whom was 2 years old, the killer did not leave. They stayed. 4 days. The exact number of days is difficult to establish, but the best estimates from investigators and forensic analysts suggest the killer remained at Hinterkaifeck for somewhere between 2 and 4 days after the murders. Some estimates go higher. During that time, they lived in the house. They ate the food in the kitchen. Investigators found evidence that provisions had been consumed. Not ransacked or scattered, consumed, like someone sitting down to eat a meal. They tended to the animals. The cows were milked. The chickens were fed. The pig was looked after. Every morning, the routine of farm life continued as if nothing had happened. As if the farmer was still alive and simply going about his day. And every day, smoke rose from the chimney. This last detail deserves special attention. Smoke from a chimney is a signal. It says, someone is here. Someone is awake. Someone is warm. In a rural community where people keep an eye on their neighbors, even from a distance, a cold chimney would have raised alarm far sooner. But a smoking chimney said everything is fine. Keep moving. The killer understood this. Whether they understood it consciously or instinctively, we can't say. But the effect was the same, the smoke kept the neighbors at bay. It kept the questions away. It bought time. And during that time, the killer was living among the dead. The bodies were in the barn, partly covered. The house was intact. Everything looked normal from outside. The animals were healthy. The fire was burning. Think about the psychology involved in this. After what this person did, after the violence, after the blood, after 6 murders, they sat down at a table in that farmhouse and ate. They slept in or near that house. They woke up in the morning and fed the animals. We do not know what was going through their mind. We have no confession, no diary, no account from anyone who might have spoken to them after the fact. But the behavior itself tells us something. It tells us that this was a person with an extraordinary ability to remain calm in the face of extreme circumstances. Either they felt no guilt, no fear, no horror at what they had done, or they felt all of those things and were capable of suppressing them completely. Both possibilities are deeply frightening. There is something else worth considering. Why stay? What was the purpose? One theory is that the killer was waiting for something. Perhaps they were waiting to be sure that no one had heard anything, that no alarm had been raised, that they were safe to leave. The longer they stayed without anyone coming, the more confident they could be. Another theory is that the killer had nowhere else to go. That they were a local person, known in the area, who couldn't suddenly appear back in the village without raising questions about where they'd been. Staying at the farm was, paradoxically, safer than leaving. A third theory, and perhaps the most disturbing, is that the killer simply wasn't ready to leave. That there was something keeping them there. Something about the house, the farm, the family they had just destroyed, that they weren't yet done with. We don't know. We will never know for certain. What we know is that when the neighbors finally came, the fire had gone cold. The killer was gone. As quietly and completely as they had arrived. It was early April 1922 when the alarm was finally raised. The exact trigger varies slightly depending on the source, but the general picture is consistent. A combination of small, accumulating absences had begun to worry people. Young Kazilia hadn't come to school for several days in a row. No explanation had been sent to the teacher. The family hadn't been seen in the village. Mail was piling up uncollected. And yet the chimney had been smoking. The farm appeared inhabited. A group of neighbors decided to go and investigate. When they arrived and received no answer at the door, they entered. What they found inside was both ordinary and deeply wrong. The house was tidy. Food had been eaten. But there was no one there. And the stillness was the wrong kind of stillness. Then they went to the barn. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the local farmer we mentioned earlier, who may have been Joseph's biological father, was among the group that day. And witnesses later noted that when Schlittenbauer entered the barn and saw the bodies, he reacted differently from the others. Where most people stumbled back, shouted, wept, or froze in horror, Schlittenbauer was calm. Almost matter-of-fact. He identified the bodies. He moved through the scene without apparent shock. Investigators would later note this as potentially significant. But it was never enough to constitute evidence of guilt. Police were summoned from the nearby town. Then detectives from Munich. Then forensic experts. The case quickly attracted attention. 6 murders in a remote farmhouse was extraordinary even in a country that had spent 4 years drowning in wartime death. The investigation began in earnest. And almost immediately, investigators were confronted with a series of puzzling facts. There were no signs of forced entry. The killer had either been let in by someone in the family, had a key, or knew another way in. This suggested either a known person or someone who had been watching the property carefully enough to learn its routines and vulnerabilities. There was no apparent robbery. Nothing of significant value appeared to have been taken. This was not a farm raid gone wrong. It was targeted. The murder weapon was never definitively recovered. A mattock found on the property was considered a strong candidate, but could not be conclusively identified as the instrument used. The killer had left no obvious evidence linking them to the crime. No personal items. No biological material that forensic science of the era could use. No clear fingerprints. Nothing. And of course, the killer had stayed for days afterward, which meant that whatever traces of their presence existed in the house were muddied and complicated by the extended occupation. The investigation produced many suspects. Let me walk you through the main ones. Karl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, declared dead in the war but never confirmed. The theory goes that he survived, came home in secret, discovered the truth about Joseph's parentage, and carried out the murders in revenge. It's a compelling narrative. But there is zero evidence that Karl Gabriel ever returned to Bavaria. And, declared dead but body not found, was unfortunately extremely common after the First World War. Millions of soldiers died without their remains ever being identified. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, his strange behavior at the crime scene, his possible paternity of Joseph, and his connections to the family made him a person of significant interest. But interest is not evidence. He was never charged. A drifter or vagrant, rural Bavaria in 1922 had no shortage of men wandering the countryside, veterans without homes, workers without work, people who had fallen through the cracks of a society that was itself crumbling. Could someone have been living rough near the farm, watching the family, waiting for an opportunity? Possible. But there was no specific individual identified. And there were others. A neighbor with a grudge. A relative with a secret. A stranger with no known connection at all. By 1922 standards, the investigation was substantial. But the tools simply weren't there. No DNA. No surveillance footage. No digital records of any kind. No mobile phones to triangulate. No databases to search. Evidence was physical, footprints, fibers, hair, marks. And most of it had been compromised by the killer's extended stay, by the initial responders handling the scene without modern protocols, and by the inevitable degradation of a rural environment. The case went cold. Not from lack of effort. From lack of answers. The Hinterkaifeck farmhouse was demolished in 1923, just 1 year after the murders. The decision was made by local authorities and the remaining family members who had inherited the property. The stones were taken away. The land was cleared. There is no marker at the site today. No monument. No official recognition of what happened there. Just land. Just grass. Just the quiet of the Bavarian countryside. And yet the story refuses to die. The Hinterkaifeck murders have been studied, debated, reconstructed, and retold for over 100 years. In the 1980s, a group of German criminology students undertook a comprehensive reinvestigation of the case, analyzing all available evidence with modern forensic methodology. They produced a detailed report and identified Lorenz Schlittenbauer as their primary suspect, but even they acknowledged they could not prove it. The case has been the subject of books, documentaries, academic papers, and countless online discussions. Every few years, someone announces that they have found the answer, that they have finally cracked it. They haven't. The answer, if there is one, is buried somewhere we cannot reach. And I think that is why this case continues to fascinate us. Because we live in an era that is deeply uncomfortable with unresolved questions. We have search engines and databases and satellite imagery. We can find almost anything. We expect that with enough effort, every mystery can be solved. Hinterkaifeck tells us otherwise. It tells us that the past can hold its secrets. That a killer can be thorough enough, or lucky enough, or simply operating in a time and place where the tools for catching them don't yet exist, and walk away. Permanently. There is also something about the specific horror of what happened here that goes beyond the murders themselves. It is the staying. We have seen terrible crimes. History is full of them. But the image of someone living in that farmhouse, eating at that table, sleeping under that roof, going through the daily motions of farm life while 6 bodies lay in the barn and in the house around them, that image does something to the human imagination that is very hard to shake. It forces a question that we don't usually have to ask: what does it take to be capable of that? What is absent in a person that would allow them to do it? Is it something they were born with, or something that was made? Is it the absence of empathy, of conscience, of fear? Or is it the presence of something else, something colder and harder and more deliberate? We don't know. We may never know. What we know is this. On the night of March 31, 1922, 6 people were alive at Hinterkaifeck farm. Andreas Gruber. Kazilia Gruber. Victoria Gabriel. 7-year-old Kazilia. 2-year-old Joseph. Maria Baumgartner, who had only just arrived. By morning, they were gone. And somewhere out there, in the Bavaria of 1922, in some village or town or field, going about their life, perhaps never speaking of what they had done, perhaps dying decades later in bed of old age, was the person responsible. We don't know their name. We don't know their face. We don't know what drove them to that farm, what they wanted, what they felt afterward, or whether they ever looked back. We know only that they were never caught. That they were never held accountable. That justice, in this case, was never served. And that is the hardest truth of all. Not the violence. Not the horror. But the silence that followed. The long, unbroken silence of a case that was never solved. Of a killer who vanished into history. Of 6 people whose deaths were never answered for. Hinterkaifeck. Remember that name. Because some stories don't end. They just stop. Thank you for watching. If this case stayed with you, and I think it will, I'd encourage you to research further, to look into the original documents and the various investigations that have been conducted over the decades. There is more detail than any single video can contain. And if you have a theory of your own about who did this, you are in very good company. Because everyone who has ever studied this case has a theory. And no one, not a single person in over 100 years, has been able to prove it.